Hello and welcome to today's topic where I'll be talking about getting started with Sitecore CDP Personalize with Sitecore XP and SXA. I'll also show briefly how to also use MVC, .NET MVC, to also get started with CDP and Personalize. So before we jump into today's integration topic, I wanted to introduce myself. My name is Dylan Young, Developer Advocate at Sitecore. I have an experience pillar focus, so most of the topics I'm going to be covering are on CDP, Personalize, Smart Hub CDP, or potentially even Sitecore Send or other products of the Sitecore composable product or traditional product. I'm a 5-time Sitecore Technology MVP, and I've been working with Sitecore for about 8 years now, either as a developer or as an architect. I've included some links there, so if you have any questions about today's topics or any other topics that you may have related to the experience pillar, please feel free to reach out to me on those channels and I'll be happy to respond. So let's look at the agenda. We're going to be covering or doing an overview of Sitecore CDP and Personalize, specifically related to the areas that we're going to cover today. We're not going to do a deep dive into the differences of these products, but there is some differences that are important for the integrations that we're going to cover. Then we're going to look at the integration scenario. So what are we trying to achieve? What are we going to build and why? And then we're going to essentially do the steps that we talked about in a hands-on fashion. And then lastly, we're going to look at the different interfaces, either the personalized tenant, the CDP instance, and look at how we might debug or understand if the events we're trying to fire and the integrations that we're trying to create, are they working or are they not working? And that's essentially what we're going to cover there. So let's take a look at an overview of Sitecore CDP and Personalize. So like I previously mentioned, today's topic is not meant to be a comprehensive deep dive into any of these products. I'm just going to talk about the differences from a UI perspective from what we're trying to achieve. So we're trying to integrate these products into our existing Sitecore instance. What in these products will be different because of their inherent nature? So Sitecore CDP out of the box is geared towards understanding your guests and understanding their interactions, understanding their attributes, and building kind of this complete profile of who your users are, but not necessarily taking any action on those users. The Sitecore Personalized product is geared to more taking action of your users, and you don't necessarily have to have the CDP already in place. It doesn't have to be Sitecore CDP, it could be another CDP product, or it could be some other way, but essentially you're going to take action on those users. So you're going to be using information, but it's not necessarily the traditional guest profile. So the guest profile that exists inside Sitecore CDP wouldn't exactly exist in the same context inside Sitecore Personalize. And I'll show the differences of those two products when I debug are the view events actually working. And then it's important to call out the Smart Hub CDP, which is essentially the old box ever product, which is Sitecore CDP plus Sitecore Personalize. And actually I'm going to show Smart Hub CDP as my tenant when I'm talking about Sitecore CDP. So Sitecore CDP and Smart Hub CDP are kind of synonymous to each other. There is some slight UI differences, but it's relatively going to be able to cover my CDP topic. So let's talk about our integration scenario. So as previously mentioned, we're going to be using XP and SXA, but we're also going to be using 10.1 and a Lighthouse demo project. Now, it's important to note that 10.1 means that it doesn't really matter what version of Sitecore that we're trying to use. This could be a 10.1 instance, it could be a 8.2 instance, it really doesn't matter here. What's important is that you can achieve it with SXA or .NET MVC to integrate Sitecore, Personalize, and CDP into your product, which kind of goes towards the migration story that I'll be sharing more in the future. The hands-on demonstration will be taking a look at creating a point of sale, and I'm only going to show this once. Then I'll showcase adding the JS library, essentially the same again across all products. They all need to collect data That library will then be used to track a view event. So we want to track our users as they navigate the site. And then I want to show this in an SXA example as well as a traditional .NET MVC example. And then lastly, like I previously mentioned, I want to do event debugging. So I want to show some of what you can see inside the browser using Chrome developer tools. And then I also want to show, as we start to track view events, I want to see those coming into our CDP product, but I also want to see what they look like inside our personalized product and show the differences that you might see from that perspective. We're using an existing repository. This is a Sitecore demo platform project available in GitHub. I provided the link there. This is just an example. I just want to show how it could be done. So this is not meant to necessarily be used as a starter kit or anything like that. Just as a, this is how we could do it. So that being said, let's go ahead and jump into our demo. To get started, we need to create a point of sale. So what is a point of sale? It's essentially a way that we can track our users to a specific kind of grouping. So an example is that you might have 5 different websites. You might want to track each one of those sites as a different kind of grouping of your users. Another example would be that you have 100 microsites, all very similar business units for your business. You might want to track them all to the same point of sale. And so in that case, you would use the same point of sale across all of those. That's kind of what a point of sale is groupings of your guests or your users of your site. So before we get started, we need to just open a browser and you need to navigate over to your tenant. Either it's personalized tenant, a CDP tenant, Smart Hub CDP tenant, whatever the case may be. They all kind of run off 3 different data centers. So we'll go over to our data center, which is appus.boxever.com. And this represents the US data center, essentially. There is app.boxever.com, which is the European environment, and then there's an APJ as well. So we'll go ahead and log in. And then once we're in here, it's quite simple to set up a point of sale. So first off, you want to make sure you're in the correct organization when you set this up. Now, if you've just recently bought CDP or Personalize or one of the combinations of it, you may have bought a multi-instance environment where you have a pre-production environment, a production environment, etc. Just make sure you're using the right one that you want to set up this process for. So we'll do that and then click on System Settings and Point of Sale. And so we already have 2 in here. We're just going to create a new one for today's demo. I'm going to call this Lighthouse Demo. The market is something arbitrary. You could say it's a US market. You could say if you're a multi-type organization, you could give us a different value. I'll just call this US brand. Again, if you're a multi-brand organization, you could give us different values, but I will just call this Lighthouse. Language is the language, obviously, that you'll be using. You could specify this as a different value. And then timeout is something that if you're a traditional .NET developer, timeouts have always been 20 minutes, or that's the default .NET environment. However, you have the ability to specify. So when does a interaction or a session of a user expire? Do you want it to be 20 minutes? Do you want it to be 40 minutes? Do you want it only to be 5 minutes? So this is where you specify that. I'm just going to specify 20 minutes because that's what I'm most used to as a .NET developer. So now we have our point of sale. Now that we have this, now we can start jumping into SXA and using this point of sale to create a view event and drop our JavaScript library in there. All right, so now let's take a look at our SXA demo. To do this, what I've done is I've already spun up my Docker instance for Sitecore Lighthouse. So if you haven't worked with Docker before, you'll need to make sure that you understand Docker in order to spin up the demo. But if you're just adding this to any SXA website that you already have, then you don't necessarily need to know Docker. It's just for this demo version, it uses Docker. So now that the site is running, we're going to navigate over to the content editor. Once we're in the content editor, what we're going to be doing today is using a kind of hacky way to add it to the site. There are better ways of doing this, especially with SXA. You could use a theme, create a JavaScript file, create a theme, or apply it to a theme of your SXA website and apply it that way. What we're going to be doing today is using a global script. This is not necessarily the best practice here because this would add it to every single instance or every single tenant of every single website on this Sitecore instance, and that's not necessarily what you want. We do want the box ever script added to pretty much everything, but it references a point of sale, and that point of sale we might want to be diversified across different sites or different scenarios. So this would not necessarily be the best case from that perspective, but it's just to show how we could do this. So what we're going to do is navigate over to global. We're going to navigate to presentation, partial designs, global metadata, data, and then what I've done already is included the HTML snippet that we're including into this partial design. If you've never done that before, there's some great documents or details on the web on how to do that and documentation, but I went ahead and did it already. So what we're going to do here, I actually have the full script here for my tests, but we're going to paste in some starting script, and I'm going to walk through how you build up these pieces of information that are needed for this script. So like I said, we're going to be adding a box ever script. This is needed in order to call the APIs, the stream APIs, to initiate. If we're pushing a view event, this is kind of the scripts that are needed to initiate that. But it's important to note that the view event that we're going to be firing as well isn't going to fire out of the box. If you just include this script on your page, it's not like Google Analytics where you drop it on a page and it just automatically starts tracking everything. This, you have to actually start tagging view events for viewing the page, but also if you have any other events you want to call. If you have a identify event, if you have a form and you want to identify the contact like you would with XP, or if you want to attract somebody clicking a play button to start playing a video. Those types of things you have to do from a JavaScript perspective. So let's get started and walking through this script. So the first variable that you'll come across, and I've kind of denoted these with kind of like a token format of brackets around the value that's needed. So the first one is needed is client key. So this is something you'll need to get from your CDP or personalized tenant. So to do that, we'll just go back to that interface. And so to get that information that we need, we'll go to System Settings, API Access. I'll obviously blur this out because I don't want you to know my client key for the personalized instance that I'm using, but we'll copy that value and then we'll navigate back to our content editor and then we'll paste that in, and I'll obviously blur that out. Then the API target endpoint. It's helpful if you look at documentation. This is a document that describes the JavaScript, basically what I'm describing today. This describes the target, and there's essentially 3 different data centers as of today. We're going to be using the US one, and so I'll go back to our content editor and I'll replace that value. And then the cookie domain. So typically you'd want this to be not including the subdomains. So let's say your delta.com, you wouldn't include the www in this. That way it could track cookies across. If you had any subdomains in there, such as like shop.delta.com, I don't know if that's a real domain or not, then it would still apply the cookie that it creates when it somebody comes to your website. It would still apply to those subdomains. But in our case, we're not really worried about that. So I'm just going to do cd.lighthouse.localhost, since that's the content delivery server for our XP instance. And then the point of sale is what we've configured previously. So that's it for the settings. One other thing to specify here, there is also a BoxEver JS library to pull in. I actually noted that this is actually not the most recent version, 1.4.8. There is also a document here that describes the JavaScript library, and you'll see that the latest version actually is 1.4.9. So we'll go back to the content editor and just update that. You don't necessarily have to keep updating, just the different versions have different features in them. So if you're going to use, in the case of these release notes, it's talking about there's some new Webflow config settings. If you're planning on using those capabilities, then you'll need to make sure that you use the appropriate version for that. Otherwise, you don't have to keep updating the version every time they come out with new versions unless you want to. So once we have the right correct BoxEver version here, and before I go on from this, I wanted to just describe real quick that this is not the same as the API version number. So a little confusion. I've seen questions on the Sitecore Slack on this topic. The API library uses 1.2, and then the JavaScript library uses a different version. All right, so that completes the actual integration of the JavaScript library. So let's talk a little bit about our push of a view event. And essentially, like I said, you're not going to track views unless you add this. So it's important to consider adding this when you add the JavaScript library. So in here, we're going to be getting the BoxEver ID. This is something that represents the cookie. So you get an ID that's also associated with a cookie, which I'll show once we get to the debugging of this. I'll show how that works. The channel, if you had a mobile device or you had maybe social media or something like that, you would change that to a different channel. You don't have to. You'll see where this comes into the dashboard, into our guest profile and our debug profile later. The type, this is just the type of event that we're firing. There's some predefined ones. View is one, identify is another, but you can also use arbitrary names as well. So if you're triggering a play button, you could call it a play button type. It's up to you what you name it. Those can all come back into the dashboard. Language and currency, not going to cover these too deeply, but obviously if you're a US based website, you'd probably be using EN and USD. The page, I've used a variable here where it's going to use JavaScript to just pull the latest, whatever page we're on, it's going to pull its href. And then lastly, we have to specify the point of sale. And that just is back to that value that we've used previously and that we configured earlier in the session. And then lastly, we just have to create this BoxEver event create, and we pass in our object that we were creating. And then once we do that, we're good to go. What I'll do is save this and we should be set to go. I'll just go ahead and publish. And then once that's done, I just want to confirm real quick that that is working. So we'll just go to the home page on Lighthouse on our content delivery instance. And the easiest way to see that that is working is go to network, and we should see a BoxEver being pulled down here. And we also should see our create. This is the create of our event. And so I'll cover this next in our debugging. So I wanted to take a step back and talk a little bit about .NET MVC. Obviously, .NET MVC and SXA kind of run hand in hand, although headless approaches also can use SXA. I wanted to talk about how you might add a integration for Sitecore CDP and Personalize on top of a .NET MVC site. Really, it's no different to adding any JavaScript library to an existing .NET MVC site. So in most cases, you're going to do this via the layout on your website. All right, so now that we've added the changes we need for SXA and for the .NET MVC site, or at least talked through the theoretical ways that we could add it for .NET MVC, now let's look at how we can debug that this is working correctly. How can we track that a view event has fired in our CDP tenant as well as our personalized tenant? All we need to do is go navigate back to our CD instance, our content delivery instance for Lighthouse or for whatever Sitecore SXA site that you're working with. And you'll want to kind of navigate the site. You don't have to necessarily do this. You can just visit the homepage, but I just use this for demonstration purposes to show that we can actually track all the different page views that this user is going through as well. So once we've done that, there's a few things that we can do to just kind of see what everything is. So there's first looking at the Chrome developer tools. There's a few things that are helpful to do here. We can go out to the console and we can actually get our BoxEver ID. This is the thing that's associated with our cookie. And it's important to put the parentheses here. If you don't, then it won't work right. It's a method. So if you call that, now we know our ID, and I'll just copy this real quick because we'll need this in a second. Another way you can get that is you can actually go on over to your application and you can see the cookie for the current domain. Within this, you can actually see a BID underscore, and then it's also specifying the value, which is the value is our ID. So this is used as a cookie, and then as you navigate via this session or future sessions, it's going to track against this cookie so that this goes back into our CDP tenant or our personalized tenant. Now that we have that, let's just jump on over to our CDP instance. And now what we want to do is confirm that those view events are actually getting into this interface. Now, if you're in a CDP tenant, which is what I'm showing right now, you're going to have this customer data section up here on the left side and something called guests. We'll go ahead and click on that. If you are not in a CDP tenant, either a Smart Hub CDP tenant or just a regular CDP tenant, and you're in a personalized tenant, then you won't see that customer data, since personalized tenant does not focus on building this guest overview of your users. And so I'll show in the next section, I'll show how you would see and understand that your view events are coming into your personalized tenant. But first, let's just look at how you could see the details of what we're triggering. So to do that, you can use the ID. You don't have to try to find it in what's currently displayed. There is a way, if you really wanted to, you could find it, but instead of having to go through those hurdles, you can just type in BID and then paste in that ID, and then you can click on this item. And it's saying that I'm now online because we just triggered that session. The session hasn't technically expired yet because the 20-minute expiration that we set on our point of sale hasn't expired yet. But let's go over and take a look at the timeline. So this takes a look at the timeline that we're experiencing, but really it's this web experience that's important here. So we can actually view this session, the session details, and you can see, hey, this user, which is me, has just navigated to all these different pages. And so this proves that the view event's working as well as the BoxEver event is firing. So that's pretty much it. Let's jump on now over to the personalized tenant. So now that we've seen the experience from a CDP tenant perspective, I wanted to quickly talk about the personalized tenant. I'm not going to go through all the steps that we just previously went through. I just wanted to share where you could see your events if you're firing events to just test out that they're working. So as you can see on the screen, I'm in a personalized tenant. You'll notice that the navigation has changed quite a bit. Our CDP tenant in this case was a Smart Hub CDP, so a lot of things didn't change necessarily, but things that you only see in the personalized tenant versus CDP tenant are a lot of the experiences, the experiments, like I said, a lot of the actions that you're going to take on the guests that you're collecting are going to be present in your personalized instance. Stuff that you will not see in this personalized tenant is all the stuff related to customer data or your guests. So that whole option that we were using for the CDP tenant to test out that our view data was getting into the system is no longer present in the personalized tenant. But there is actually another option that you do not see inside the CDP tenant, which is the event debug option. So inside this option, you basically have the same interface as you would when you search for guests. You can search by their BoxEver ID, essentially the ID of the user. When they go to a page, they get this ID that's attached to their cookie, and then that ID you can use to search here. You can also search on other guest data here. Just keep in mind that the retention of that data is not as long term as it is with a CDP instance. So if you're just implementing this for the first time, you're tracking a new view event, this is a great way just to kind of debug that your data is getting in there as you expect. So that concludes today's topic. Feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions on today's topics. But if not, look forward to seeing you next time when I cover future topics on the experience pillar. Thank you.